Well, I just put glue on the back side of my spine along its entire length. So now I have a glued back. I'm going to just very carefully lift up the bow just a little bit, enough to allow me to slide the spine under it and put the tip of the spine where the nose is on the wax paper, not on the kite itself. And then as I align the location of the spine to the line that I drew for the spine, then I press it down and I pull the wax paper out. Pretty slick. Well, we have the kite bow and spine installed, glued in, and the glue is now dry. I just put a piece of tape on my cutting mat here, and I'm cutting out some pieces that are about 1 inch square. I measured from the wingtip to this line 5 inches, wingtip to this mark 4 inches. I'm going to put a piece of tape right up against the edge of the leading edge, not over it, and wrap this around the bow and onto the kite. Now if this were clear tape, you wouldn't see it obviously, but it is clear tape. Or if I were to make it a different dimension, it would also be invisible. So I'll put this on here. I want to hold the bow down, but I don't want to distort its shape in the process of putting the tape on. The purpose of this tape is to reinforce the leading edge in such a way that it won't accidentally get pushed under the bow. And so I'll do that on both sides. Now when using tape, one of the most important aspects is to make sure that the tape is really smoothed down onto whatever you're taping. It helps not only with the bonding of whatever you're sticking the tape to, but when you're flying a kite, let's say you're at a park on a grass field, pieces of grass will find their way into open areas between the parts that are bonded if you don't do that. If the tape is kind of loose in certain places. So we're going to reinforce those. Now we're going to put tape at the nose and the tail of the kite. And here I'm just going to cut about a 2-inch square here. So to reinforce the nose of the kite and the tail of the kite, I'm going to put a piece of tape right on top of the spine at the nose and just press it down on the spine and then on each side of the spine, and make sure the tape is burnished down good all around here. This is an area that gets an awful lot of abuse by the wind, and it needs some extra strength. The same is true for the tail. I'll do the same thing here on the tail of the spine. I'll put the tape on the tail, or attempt to anyway. But with this tape, this Tyvek tape shows up really well on the video, so that's a good thing. I'm glad I found this. the clear tape would be very, very difficult to see. So now, there's only two things, well, there's a few things, but mainly two things we need to do. One, put the bridle on, and the bridle is a 3-point bridle. 3 points meaning that it connects to the kite in 3 places. It's going to connect at the bow. It'll go right through the sail, tied to the bow up here and up here, 1.5 inches on either side of the middle of the spine. That'll be one piece of the bridle. It'll be just a loop. It'll go like this. And then the lower part will be tied down here. And we'll make the bridle in just a little while. The other thing we'll need to do, if you're using carbon fiber, is to make a line from around the center of the kite to the nose area and tie a knot that is called a top line hitch, and I'll have a link at the description below that will provide the information on how to tie the knot. It's pretty simple, but it's really a good knot and completely adjustable. So that's our next step. Since the bridle goes through the sail and ties to the bow and goes through the sail and ties to the spine, I'm also going to tie the bow to the spine where they cross right here. Now that's optional. It's not something that has to be done. I usually do it on my kites. It helps to improve the performance of the kite a little bit. It's not a big deal, but I prefer it, so that's what I'm going to do. You don't have to. Now I'm going to measure 1.5 inches from the center of the spine, or nearly the center, eyeball it, 1.5 inches on one side, and I'm going to put a mark right on the sail, and I'm going to put 1.5 inches on the other side, put a mark on the sail. I'm also going to put a mark on here where I'm going to tie the bow to the spine, and I'm going to measure up 5 inches and a quarter from the tail and put a mark here for where the lower bridle will be connected to the spine, again, through the sail. The bridle is on the front side of the kite. Now, when making a hole in this kind of material, mylar or polyfilm of any kind like this, do not just poke a hole in it with something sharp and tie the line through it like that. What will happen is the material will just split and you'll ruin the kite. It has to be melted. The hole has to be made by melting it. You can use a nail and just heat it up on the stove and do it, or you can use a soldering iron like I have here. This is a little portable, rechargeable soldering iron, and I just melt a hole through the sail. You don't want to touch the carbon fiber with the hot material though. It is very sensitive to heat, so you want to be careful about that. Now you can see I wasn't all that careful, I guess you'd say, but I just want these holes to be such that when I put the bridle through here, the bridle will not rub on the sail material itself. And the bridle material, I use a braided Dacron. It's way heavier, way stronger than it needs to be, but it's very easy to see on the video, and I'm going to use it. You can use a lighter weight material, any kind of string or thread that won't break under about 8 or 9 pounds of tension is fine, as long as it does not stretch. You can't have bridle line that stretches. That will just give you nothing but trouble when you're flying your kite. So I'm going to cut a few pieces here. One will be for this loop here, the upper bridle yoke. A longer piece for the lower bridle. And another piece for where I attach my flying line to the bridle, which is called the toe point. We'll start with making the toe point. Just fold over the string so it's in a loop and make a knot to make a loop. It can be an inch or two, it can be any length, but so now I have a loop there. I'm going to trim this tail part off a little bit, not a lot. I want a little bit left on here. And you want this big enough so you can get your hand in there and go like this, because that is how you're going to attach your flying line to the kite bridle. And this will be attached to the bridle when we're finished. So the first one we're going to do is the upper bridle yoke. And here we're going to tie one end to the bow and the other end to the bow using any knot that you know will hold well. Now when we get these tied, we're going to put a drop of super glue on them to hold them in place. So the knot itself is only to hold the bridle on the bow. It doesn't really, it won't be tight enough to keep it in place without the glue. So don't worry about that aspect. And I like to just snug up the knot real well by holding the bow, pressing on the sail, but holding the bow down and pulling a little bit. And then I'm going to do the other end, tie it to the bow over here. Well, when I do this, there's one important thing that has to be considered. The length of this loop cannot reach the nose. If it does, if you make it long enough so it will, when you're flying the kite, it will wrap around the nose. Guarantee it. And when it does, the kite will crash. So, if you make the kite so it can't do that, you minimize one possible crash situation, and that's always a good thing, I think. All fighter kites crash. I don't care how good a flyer you are, they always crash at some point. Now I'm going to trim this off, and I'm going to use my super glue after I tie the next piece of the bridle. Now this piece is much longer. I don't know how long it is, but I would guess, well, let's see here. It's about 30 inches long. I don't know if it needs to be that long, but I'm going to loop over about 4 inches of it up here and tie a knot. So I'll have a loop on one end and just plain string on the other, like this. I'm going to put this loop, I'm going to connect it go under this yoke here that we just made. I'm going to poke the knot of the loop on the lower bridle line and pull it through, and this creates what is called a lark's head knot. This is an adjustable knot that allows the movement of the lower bridle on the upper bridle, right to left, that allows you to adjust the kite while you're flying it for any small errors that might have occurred during construction where it's not exactly the equal on right and left side of the spine. Now I'm going to tie the other end to the spine, going through the sail hole that I've melted. Now here, when we do this, we have the same issue. We don't want it to be long enough to go around a wingtip. If we do have it that long, that's where it will go. It'll always be that way, I guarantee it. You may not think so when you're out flying, but all of a sudden, there it'll be wrapped around there, and your kite's headed to the ground, and there's not much you can do about it. So now we have the bridle tied, and this reaches out near the end, but not to it. And now we attach the toe point, or the toe connector, to the bridle. And this is where we just loop this like here, poke the knot through this loop, and just pull it, and it creates a lark's head knot on the lower bridle, and it's adjustable. I can adjust this to move up and down on the bridle line, to adjust the angle of attack of the kite based on the wind and so on, which we'll get into in a second here. I'm going to trim this off. Now I'm going to turn the kite over, and I'm going to use my ruler and measure again 1.5 inches on either side of the spine where the line is attached. And I am going to put a piece of wax paper underneath here, so when I put my super glue on, it will not go right on and bond the kite to the cutting mat here. I don't want that to happen. Here I'm going to put the wax paper under here, and I'm going to use another piece of wax paper and a toothpick, and I am just going to put a little bit of super glue on the wax paper, and then I'm going to use a toothpick and put a little bit of the glue on the tip of the toothpick and dab it onto the connecting knot at the 1.5 inch mark on both sides of the spine here. And I'm also going to do the same here. I'm going to put a little dab right there to connect it to the spine. So now I let that dry, and the bridle will have been installed. Well, you can see I have tied the bow to the spine right here, and I put a piece of reinforcing tape where I'm going to connect my line for my tension to make the bow or the spine bend. And I did the same up here. Up here I put just a little loop, tied it on, and here I have another loop, but it has a long line on it. And this is what I'm going to use, this line, to tie my top line hitch. Just going to tie this loop on here, and I'll show you what happens next. Now these connections here for the taut line hitch tension line on the spine are going to be super glued in position so that there isn't any chance for them to move. And when that happens, I'll just run that line through one loop, back through the other loop, and then I will tie the taut line hitch right onto the line that just went through the loop. And it will be tied like this. Just go under here and around this a couple times. And then you bring it around and make a little half hitch here. Well, I have my taut line hitch tied, and you can see now that I have the nose. When I push the tail of the spine flat to the table, the nose is raised up off the table, and you can adjust that with this knot right here, with this line, and make it more or less depending on what you want when you're flying the kite. You should start it out so that it's about 1.5 to 1 inch above the table, and that would be a good place to start. Now that the kite is done, I have a couple of little final things to take care of. One, because the glue we put on the bow, we put around the entire circumference of it in this area, and it's exposed, and even though it's dry, it's sticky. So to kill that stickiness, you don't want that. It'll pick up sand or grass or wherever you're flying material, plus it'll stick to kites when you put this in your kite box. So I just use a talcum powder, baby powder, cornstarch, something like that, and just dust it right along that sticky part. Any place that there's some exposed glue or tape, I dust it like that, and then I just brush it off. And that takes care of killing all of the stickiness that was there before. The other thing we're going to do is when we put these little tabs on, I had a little piece of tape sticking out on one end of the kite, on one wingtip. You may or may not. You may be a much neater kite maker than me. I hope so. But there's two ways we can deal with that. One is just use the knife and carefully cut off the excess. The other is to use the hot cutter and to melt it so that it's lined up correctly. And that's what I would do. I would use a hot cutter or a soldering iron or whatever hot thing you're using. And I would just very, very carefully put it close enough to melt the part that's sticking out. Because we're using synthetic materials, and I'm assuming you are too, melting is often the very best solution for little things like that, and especially for making holes. So I'll dust this off and go to the kite field, have some fun.